Kia ora, haere mai. That was Maori and roughly means hello and welcome. Today I'm going to film a little section for my long-term project in 80 books around the world. I have a European cruise or a European round trip where I want to read a book for every country in Europe. And I've got a Tour de France where I read a book for every one of the former départements. And I also have a South Pacific cruise where I want to read a book for every island nation or country in the South Pacific. And there are 18 books in total, and this is going to be part 1 where I show you the first 9 books. The first book is for Australia and it's called Girls Like You, written by Paul Sheehan. Paul Sheehan is an investigative journalist and he follows the story of Tegan Wagner in this book. Tegan was raped and sexually assaulted by 6 brothers in 2002 in Sydney, I think. And she and her friend or another girl escaped from these brothers, went to the police, reported the crimes and got them arrested and brought to trial. You have to know that only a fraction of sexual assaults in Australia are actually reported to the police. And out of these reported crimes, only a fraction is actually brought to court. And again, out of those cases that go to court, only a fraction of offenders are actually sentenced to prison. So Tegan Wagner was 14 years old when she went against all the statistics and made sure that her assailants were brought to trial and got sentenced. Paul Sheehan recounts the whole story, what happened in the beginning, how it all went down, and then follows the court proceedings. And this court case lasted over 4 years and cost more than $3 million of Australian dollars in taxpayers' money. But Tegan got them convicted. And I think she's a hero because she was underage. She had the right to remain anonymous, but she waived this right in order to make the case public, to help other victims come forward and bring their assailants to trial. So this is a really, really exciting read. It's upsetting, but also exciting. Another thing about the book is that Paul Sheehan really, really highlights the Australian court system that does not protect victims at all. Tegan Wagner was even cross-examined by her assailants, the Khan brothers, directly in court, in person. And it's really, really interesting to read, and how much the justice system in Australia still has to change in the 21st century. Book number 2 is about the Cook Islands. It's called An Island to Oneself, written by Tom Neal. Tom Neal was a shopkeeper in the South Pacific area for years and always had a dream of living on a remote island all by himself. No technology, no cars, no people, no nothing. And one day he turned his dream into a reality. He let himself be dropped off on a tiny little island in the Cook Islands called Suvarov, and he lived there for 6 years all by himself, without technology, without contact to anyone. And this book is the story of his very own personal adventure as a real-life Robinson Crusoe. Book number 3 takes place on Fiji. It's called The Sailmaker's Daughter. It was written by an author called Stephanie Johnson. And I got this book because I thought it was something about Fiji, about Fijian natives, about the life and traditions and way of life on Fiji. But I was a little bit disappointed to find out that the protagonist is a 10-year-old white girl of European origin. Her family, I think, has lived on Fiji for several generations. However, they are more, it's during the colonial era. So they live in a nice house up on the hill, and they've got Fijian cooks and nannies and people who work for them from Fiji and from India, because there's a lot of Indians living on Fiji. And it follows this girl through a period of her childhood that for some reason has significance for her. But it isn't really about Fiji. It could have taken place anywhere where white people live in a colony and have native people working for them. So it could have been South Africa, it could have been India. It's not significant that it is on Fiji. There's another reason I didn't like this book, but I have to spoiler you. I'm going to put my hand up and you can switch off the volume if you don't want to be spoiled. And when I take my hand down again, you can put the volume on again. But there were a lot of scenes that I didn't understand why they had to be in there that involved sexual acts or genitals or things like that, whether that be the grandmother who's got thrush and scratches herself between her legs a lot, or a couple that has sex at night outside, or somebody's washing their genitals thinking they're alone, or the father ends up shagging a woman who's not his wife, or whatever. Every single time this 10-year-old protagonist is present and watches everything, so that we as the reader can follow what is happening in the story. And I thought it was so unnecessary, because first of all, the 10-year-old child doesn't need to be present every time something sexual happens. This pre-pubescent voyeurism was really not to my taste. And secondly, it's told in third-person perspective, which means the author could have told us all these scenes and stories without the child having to be there. And also, they weren't relevant to the book or to the story at all. She could have just left it out altogether. So that's what I did not like about this book. And spoiler over, on to the next book. The next book is for Guam, and it is called And No Birds Sing by Mark Jaffe. It tells the true story of how a serial killer decimated nearly all life on this island. And it's not a human serial killer. The culprit in this case is an animal. It is the brown tree snake that somehow made it onto this island from God knows where, and has no natural enemies or no natural predators on this island at all. So the brown tree snake population exploded in the shortest of times, and they just devoured everything they could get. Birds, everything that lived there, even pets weren't safe, and humans were attacked, and these snakes are everywhere. They're hanging in the trees, they're lying in the grass, they're lying on the street, they're absolutely everywhere. And Mark Jaffe tells in this ecological thriller the whole story of how a tree snake arriving on this island somehow manages to completely take over and turn this island into a practical ghost town. Very exciting read. Book number 5 is taking place in Kiribati mostly. It is called Treasure Islands, The Trials of the Banabans, written by Pearl Binder. Banaba was a little island, I think, east of Kiribati, that was merely 2 miles long and had a few thousand inhabitants living on it, that were just living there happily, doing their daily life and their rituals and their whatever. And they were completely undisturbed by the rest of the world because there was nothing particularly interesting about them. Just islanders living on an island. However, it turned out that they were sitting on one of the largest deposits of phosphate in the world. So, of course, all the nations that thought they had a legitimate interest in that, mainly New Zealand, Australia, and the UK, descended onto this island and wanted to mine the phosphate. The Banabans were simply relocated to another island in Kiribati, and the island of Banaba was then mined for the phosphate, and so extensively that basically there's nothing left of this island, bare a few broken coral reefs. So the island's gone. But the Banabans then went to trial, and they sued this so-called Phosphate Commission, and it turned into one of the longest ever court cases in history. It went on for, I think, over 50 years before it was settled. And this book is the story of the Banabans and their trials about their lost island. Number 6 is taking place in the Marshall Islands. It's a little science fiction that does not take place in the future, but in the present. It's called Fish Heads, written by Leonard Schoenberg, and it follows a doctor who is stationed on this very small island in the Marshalls, who discovers a very peculiar secret. And she turns to a colleague on the next bigger island, who puts her into contact with a government agent who comes and visits her on this tiny island, and together they try to solve this mystery, or to get to the bottom of this secret. And the question very quickly arises whether it's got anything to do with the A-bomb tests in the Bikini Atoll conducted by the US government. And if yes, what does this mean for the Marshall Islands, and what does it mean for the US government who's responsible for it? And does this threaten the national security of both the Marshall Islands and the US? And it's very exciting to read. It's a little thriller. There's a little love story as well, but it doesn't distract from the main story at all, so that was okay. And I would have liked the ending to be a bit more extensive, but it was okay. I really had fun reading this. Number 7 is from Micronesia, and it's the only book I don't physically own yet. It is on its way, I've ordered it, and it was a little hard to find a book taking place in Micronesia that piqued my interest. There's not that much literature out there that I could find on my, not very long one-day research. It's called Some Things of Value, Micronesian Customs as Seen by Micronesians. I noticed that the title on the cover is different when I put together the covers to be shown. It's by Jean Ashby, and all I know about this book is that it contains stories written by Micronesians attending college, I think. I don't know how many stories there are. I don't know whether they're good or not. I don't know if they are made up stories or whether they are real stories that really took place. So I'm very looking forward to that one. My next book takes place in Nauru. It's called Nauru Burning and is written by Mark Isaacs, another investigative journalist who looks at what took place on Nauru in July 2013, because on Nauru is located the detention centre of the Australian Immigration Service, where all unwanted immigrants, unwanted asylum seekers are held in detention for an indeterminable time, and they don't know whether they're going to get out again or when. Journalists are not welcome on this island, and there's not a lot of news coverage on these detention centres from within Nauru. And in July 2013 there was a riot in the detention centre, and a fire broke out which spread very quickly and destroyed a lot. And of course it's very dangerous to be held behind bars and locked up when there's a fire spreading through the buildings and you can't run away. So Mark Isaacs looks at how the whole riot developed and how the fire spread and what happened, and looks at the whole aftermath. I found it very interesting because this is something the Australian government really does not want you to know about. So I think everybody should read it. Book number 9 is for New Zealand, and I've chosen a historical fiction. It follows a young girl called Amy. She's 15 years old in 1881, living on a farm in a rural village in the Bay of Plenty. And she gets a new stepmother that she doesn't really get along with that well. And her stepmother has relatives in the big city who come to visit one summer. Amy ends up pregnant by a boy called Jimmy, who after the summer disappears back into the big city, never to be seen again. So now 15-year-old Amy is pregnant in 1881, and of course you can't have that at all. You can't just be a single mum in the late 19th century in a very remote farming community. So now no self-respecting man will take her as a wife, and her neighbor Charlie Stewart offers to marry her, to make her a respectable woman, and to enable her to have her son within a marriage. And he is much older than Amy. He drinks a lot, he doesn't have any friends, he's a bit weird, but she takes up his offer and marries him. And this book follows her from her first pregnancy through her marriage, having more children, and her life with Charlie Stewart and with her relatives who live on neighboring farms and so on. And it was really well written because, yes, it's the story of Amy, but at the same time, it's such a good description of life in this era, how it unfolded and how technology changed. And I have read the following books as well. They follow her children and her grandchildren, and it was a really entertaining read. Those were the first 9 books in my South Pacific cruise. Leave me a comment whether you've read any of those books, and if yes, whether you've liked them or not. Do you also go on literary excursions into other countries? Do you have a list of books you want to read from abroad? Or do you don't care where the book is taking place and just read whatever you fancy? If you don't want to miss the second part of this cruise, which is coming soon, click on the subscribe button and the little bell and you won't miss it. Also, if you leave me a thumbs up, that would really help my channel grow, and I hope you're watching next time. Bye!